Reacting to NFL Week 2 with the Monday review. We are here on RotoViz Overtime. It's myself, Shawn. It's myself, Colm Kelly. I'm joined by Shawn Siegele. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation here as we kind of give some rapid-fire takeaways from some of the action from NFL Week 2, which I think, Shawn, in my opinion, was more interesting in general than NFL Week 1. There's obviously parts of it that are probably down to certain players' performances and so on. But I think even in games where players that we have backed this season did not perform, I thought some of the offensive play in those situations was better. Will that continue? Was Week 1 the truth? I had a lot of reflection on Week 1 heading into Week 2, thinking of the, you talk about bye weeks and teams having time to prepare. A lot of the players that were completely snuffed out in Week 1 or had difficult situations, some of that was down to teams game planning them out of the entire game plan from a defensive perspective. We've seen some of that rebound this week. We also seen a lot of players pick up injuries over the course of the last kind of 24 hours, and even some of those players picking up injuries in the warm-up, for example, with Evan Ingram. Just some weird scenarios happening in Week 2, but I'm looking forward to talking through some of them with you, Shawn. But my biggest impact on NFL Week 2 was a newborn son that has entered the Kelly household. We have a new member of the RotoViz OT community here. Ryan Kelly was born last Tuesday, so we did not this past week have a Friday edition. And myself and Shawn were thinking about squeezing it in, and then I just thought, yeah, we'll just let this one slide past. We rarely miss an edition here, Shawn, of RotoViz OT, so a special occasion to spend some time with the family. So everyone's settling in at home now, but Week 2 was a different experience. There was numerous nappies to be changed and so on during the viewing of these games, but wouldn't change it for the world. So pretty big week here for me and the fam.
Well, Colm, congratulations. That was the most exciting news, I think. There between
Shawn, do not tell me that when Brock Bowers was racking up those receptions and JSN was making those catches, that was not more exciting for Shawn Siegele.
I don't know. It was really cool to get your message, and just couldn't be more excited for you. As we talked a little bit last night on Siegele Bananas, it was exciting to get the Brock Bowers, to get the JSN. I mean, it's not going to be like that every week, but I mean, that was the thesis, and we definitely saw it. That part, I think, very, very exciting. Colm, one of the games that Ben and I didn't discuss a lot last night because I hadn't had a chance to watch it yet, and I did immediately watch it after the show, has a lot of young players, a lot of fantasy relevant players, two like really, really bad teams, but bad in a way I think that is interesting. And that would be the Washington Commanders versus the New York Giants. This is one where we talk about, that group of 5, basically, where you have the potential for there to be 5, borderline transcendent players from this class. The truly generational prospect was Brock Bowers, but at receiver, you have Marvin Harrison and Malik Nabers. At quarterback, you have Caleb Williams and Jayden Daniels. Right now, it looks like Caleb Williams, despite what they tried to surround him with on offense, is going to be the guy who struggles, probably because the offensive coordinator is not up to the task. But, I mean, he needs to make some better plays in some instances as well. The flip side of that is that Jayden Daniels, through 2 weeks, has looked absolutely fantastic. Now, some of that is going to come down simply to schedule, because we have pretty good reason to believe after 2 weeks that the New York Giants have an all-time bad defense. We also have reason to believe that the Washington Commanders have an all-time bad defense. That's set up for a fun game, because if you're talking about all-time bad defenses, these were not the defenses to corral Jayden Daniels and Malik Nabers. One of the things you would have liked to see, and one of the things that was so crazy about this game, Colm, is that those 18 targets for Malik Nabers came within a context where the Giants only ran 51 plays, in part because, again, their defense being apocalyptically bad allowed a 16-play field goal drive to start that burned up 2/3 of the first quarter. And then they followed that up by allowing a 10-play field goal drive and then a 14-play field goal drive. One of the things here for the Commanders is like get in the end zone, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, this is a game where you desperately needed Daniel Jones to bounce back. And if you're going to ever bounce back, it has to be against a defense as bad as the Washington Commanders. And the Giants would have won this game if Devin Singletary doesn't commit that back-breaking fumble.
Yeah, this was an unusual game for a number of reasons. You've kind of hit on quite a few of them there, but one of the most unusual, Shawn, is I don't know if I've ever seen a more condensed box score than this New York Giants, where you have 3 ball carriers in the game, but 16 of the 22 carries go the way of Devin Singletary. 5 of them go to Daniel Jones. And then out of the team's 27 targets, 18 of them go to Malik Nabers, 4 to Slayton, 4 to Robinson, 1 to Singletary. There's pretty much like just a handful of players involved in this offense. The Giants, though, obviously outside of Nabers' 10 receptions, did really struggle moving the ball. Wan'Dale Robinson is a nice reception that he rushes in for a touchdown at that point. But, you know, overall, the entire team had some struggles. You mentioned the play volume, and, you know, they could have won the game even with those struggles. The trouble, I think, a little bit with the Commanders at the minute is, like, there's a little bit of a lack of explosiveness in the offense in general. They have a 34-yard completion to Noah Brown being the longest play of the game. They do have a play that goes to Austin Eckler for 27 yards on a reception as well. But overall, I think there's a lack of explosiveness outside of kind of 3 plays in the entire game, the other one being a rush attempt by Brian Robinson that goes for 40 yards. So I think that we're seeing teams, not specifically in this game, but teams I talked about last week settling for field goals. I think we've seen that a little bit less this week, but the teams that were settling last week were still settling. And the situation with the new kickoff rules, there is some situations where, you know, you get 1 first down, or certainly if you get 2 first downs, you're pretty much in with a field goal attempt at that point. And I think some offenses then are being very conservative from that nature as well. So you have to look at the positives, and the 2 rookies that we're really looking at in this game are Jayden Daniels and Malik Nabers. And there's obviously a point during this game, Shawn, where you're like, well, Malik Nabers certainly is going to have a better rookie season than Marvin Harrison. And then, like, 70 minutes later, you're like, well, Marvin Harrison's had a pretty good first quarter here. So there's obviously a lot of excitement to see those young players take that early step forward, at this point of the season. And then you mentioned Brock Bowers, a lot of young players to be excited about. There's other ones then that are having their struggles. You mentioned the situation with Williams and the Bears. We've seen Bo Nix have struggles in these games, not entire offense. Again, that Denver team running a little bit strange through the opening 2 weeks, but Jayden Daniels, Shawn, is going to be electrifying. And if they can get into situations where they start adding those explosive passes down the field, and he can start to get those passing touchdowns and get it in the end zone, because that's the difference in this being a really good game and being an absolutely fantastic game in terms of the fantasy points that he could put up. That is really the next step. We kind of did see that a little bit with like the difference in Kyler Murray in week 1 and Kyler Murray in week 2 was, those plays hitting and getting in the end zone, really changing the overall fantasy score for them. So it's really positive to have 2 weeks in, and to also, like, you talk about the all-time bad defense that the Commanders are going to have. That's going to lead to them needing to score. And like, they're playing the Giants here, so yeah, let's settle for field goals. But my first thought was when they were settling for the field goals early in this game, a little bit like the Packers the week previously against the Eagles. Like, when you get inside the 10-yard line, you need to be trying to punch those in, and even if it is on 4th down. The other thing you mentioned, Singletary's fumble. We had a number of just absolutely crushing fumbles this week that were reminiscent of the Travis Etienne one in week 1, where he's heading in, into the 5-yard line and fumbles. And we've seen that a number of times in week 2, where games were really changed in very quick succession by some errors like that. But I have to say, for all the struggles as well on the Giants side, Malik Nabers looks just tremendous. And I'm just super enthusiastic about how the rest of that rookie season can go. And if they can get any semblance of actual quarterback play from Daniel Jones, it if you slot Malik Nabers, and I'm going to say one of the most exciting players that I've watched through 2 weeks, and certainly in week 2, was Nico Collins. Nico Collins, a player that I've drafted quite a bit of, but I was very much on the Dell and Diggs side when we're looking at it. He just looks to be so much fun. But if you imagine Malik Nabers, let's say, paired with a CJ Stroud versus a Daniel Jones, I think the ceiling is pretty much limitless in terms of the potential of Nabers here moving forward. So let's just hope Daniel Jones can help support that. The part that I don't like, Shawn, about the Washington Commanders, and we won't spend much time on this, is Zach Ertz is leading the way here in terms of the yardage totals for the receivers, 4 for 62 and 4 targets for him. But the only player with more than 4 targets in this offense was Terry McLaurin, 6 for 22. So we'll see if they can fix some of those and start to work on some things better. The other part is Brian Robinson is clearly leading that backfield over Austin Eckler. He has 133 rushing yards on the 17 carries. So any other notes for you, though, Shawn, in that game, other than tremendous to see those rookies, looking like they are as advertised?
Just that I think Daniel Jones played a lot better maybe than you're giving him credit for. The game was lost because of the fumble, and then because Malik Nabers drops a pass that you have to catch. Now,
I'm not saying that he is the reason they didn't win this game. I'm saying, like, if you're going 16 of 20 for 172 yards, like, we should be trying to, the level should be above that.
That would be great if some of the teams would come in with quarterback play above that. It was another very dispiriting week from a passing perspective. You do need
a game we're not going to talk about, Shawn, and I don't know if you've seen this yet. Will Levis, has he seen football before? In terms of, have you seen the fumble that the backwards pass for the?
It was entertaining, I thought, in that one, that as he comes off, his quarterback, his head coach was not like, good effort and nice try. He was ranting and raving about, what are you doing?
With other words added in. You can fill in the blanks.
The play from Will Levis, one of the things that was really cool, and we talked about some last year, is that Will Levis is a fantastic athlete. He's got a huge arm, and he competes like crazy. You could argue that maybe he competes too hard. Much.
Yeah.
The problem is
you need 11 other down, man. Like, that's 2 weeks in a row with just like the most baffling interceptions. One of them returned for a touchdown. It's tough.
I would argue he's not surrounded by that good of a team. And when you have some of the mistakes like Calvin Ridley dropping the deep ball, that type of thing, you just love to see the competitiveness from the quarterback. The problem is, again, he's not good enough to start at the NFL level. This game that we're discussing here with the Commanders, Giants, the Commanders didn't punt, right? They kick a field goal on all 7 possessions. They had 7 possessions, not including the one that ends the half. They kicked 7 field goals. You talked about a lack of explosiveness, but Brian Robinson averages almost 8 yards a carry. Austin Eckler is also very good there. They do spread it around. There are positives to that, but I completely agree with you that you've got to unlock Terry McLaurin more vertically. The problem that they simply have is that outside of Terry McLaurin, their personnel is really weak. And it's fine against the New York Giants. It's going to be a problem for them against quality teams. But the thing that you love to see in this game is that Jayden Daniels got the ball out fast. That's a little bit of the design of the offense, which has both strengths and weaknesses. Again, everything being horizontal is a problem. And yet his ability to get the ball fast, get the ball out on a line, get the ball out accurately. This looks like a much more elementary type of offense than what some of the other rookie quarterbacks are being asked to run. And so we can't necessarily simply say, he looks like he can handle this level no problem compared to some of the other guys. They're not exactly asking him to do anything. And yet at the same time, the combination of ball out and accuracy, the arm talent there with Daniels, again, just as advertised. And then the feet are pretty crazy. He looks basically exactly like Lamar Jackson. So the thesis for him that's so exciting about being Lamar Jackson who can actually pass is a pretty big deal. Both of these teams are going to look at this game and say we should have won by more, and or if you're the Giants, we had to win this game. This is the weakest opponent we're going to play all year. We're looking at, a 3-14, 2-15 type of season. That's a lot of pressure when you're staring down the barrel of 0-2, and already in week 2 you have a virtual must win.
Yeah, this felt like a game, when they're trading those field goals, Shawn, where I thought at some points, are they thinking if we lose this game, we have a shot here already at the first overall pick? I was kind of wondering how teams wanted to play it, but obviously the coaches, the players, they're playing for their careers and things like that, so that's more so tongue-in-cheek. Shawn, a team that was playing and had a real hope to win a massive game on the road this week was the Cincinnati Bengals. They are now 0-2 with a difficult situation where they lose with a buzzer-beater field goal to the Kansas City Chiefs. Another game which had I think a lot to talk about. We've talked about some of the backfield splits in week 1. Some concern here, quite a bit of concern around how the backfield is starting to shake out in Cincinnati with Zach Moss and Chase Brown in terms of the split between those two guys. We get 12 carries for Moss, the 4 carries for Chase Brown. Again, a bit like we talked about in some of the situations last week, 34 yards on those 12 carries for Moss, 31 yards on those 4 carries for Chase Brown. A note that one of the highlights, Shawn, that I thought was going to be one of my most enjoyable plays of NFL week 1, I had some things to take care of with the pets around the house, and I'm kind of watching the games and I'm like, right, I'm going to do that now. And I see a long deep ball to Mike Gesicki that it looks like he's caught a touchdown. The commentators called a touchdown. I'm like, oh, that's a kind of a feel-good note to walk away on. Obviously, that was called back in week 1, but we get Gesicki in this 9 targets, 7 receptions, 91 yards, a long of 37. We do get a lot of tight ends mixed in this one across the board. Obviously, we have no T. Higgins. Yoshivas gets involved with just 4 targets, but he has 2 receptions for 7 yards, but those are 2 receptions for 2 touchdowns. When you look at the depth behind Ja'Marr Chase, when you are missing out on T. Higgins, it does start to become a little bit depleted as well with the Bengals. Ja'Marr Chase kind of bottled up. They kind of did a little bit like you talked about with Justin Jefferson last week after the Addison injury. They kind of covered him, took him out of the game. 5 targets for 4 receptions for 35 yards. Rashee Rice gets a deep shot into the end zone for 44 yards and a touchdown. He finishes with 5 for 75. I thought really impressive. Like the way, last week kind of trying to work him across the middle, short to intermediate routes, and then changing it up a little bit this week. We don't get the explosive plays from Worthy in this one, just the 4 receptions. Obviously, you get the injury at the end to Isaiah Pacheco, who had 19 yards rushing on 90 yards rushing on 19 attempts. But Shawn, I thought that the Bengals did a lot right in this game. They are a team that went for it in 4th down, picked up one of those touchdowns to Yoshivas. I thought they were aggressive. I thought Joe Burrow looked pretty good throughout the game. I think that just the efficiency of the Chiefs, and they kind of punished them in certain moments in this one to get the W. What were some of your takeaways here with Pacheco now likely out for multiple weeks? We're probably going to see Carson Steele in there with Samaje Perine, but Perine's usage as well, a little bit strange with just the 1 target for him late in the game for 3 yards, no rushing attempts. What are you expecting here with the Chiefs, the Bengals moving forward? The other part, as you mentioned last week about, Travis Kelce, he has 3 targets here, 1 reception for 5 yards. He did have 1 called back on a penalty, which would have been a long gain, but he's completely been phased out. But maybe that is part of other teams trying to take him away, and we see situations then where it opens it up for other names in the offense.
Yeah, you had a lot of mistakes in this game by the Chiefs, and some. There
was also, I'll get your thoughts here. Sometimes we like to give out a bit the rest. Quick thought on the DPI penalty that leads to the field goal. Penalty or not a penalty? I thought that was really, really close, and I would lean towards that shouldn't be punished as a penalty.
I didn't look at it that closely because I could tell that it was going to be called a penalty. Yeah. I mean, he hits the guy before the ball gets there, so I mean,
it's pretty. I think it's milliseconds early. he's going to make a play on the ball, and the receiver's there, and he hits into. I can see why it's called. I also think that it's pretty harsh.
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of pass interference not called in these games. It seemed like
we'll leave it at that.
Yeah,
Shawn's willing to.
I mean, the Bengals dominated this game. The Bengals deserve to win. So, I mean, from that perspective, it's unfortunate, right? Because, I mean, the Chiefs were an absolute train wreck. Now, the Bengals, for their part, I mean, they've got to start leaning into their good players. This is an absolute joke in the running game. Now, it's tricky for me to be in any way. I mean, obviously, I'm not unbiased, but even with the bias, to give a reasonable feedback on it. But, I mean, Chase Brown looks shot out of a cannon, and Zach Moss looks like the guy who failed in a fantastic situation in Buffalo. What are they possibly doing? Every time that they give the ball to Zach Moss, and I mean, you're killing your team. It made absolutely no sense. And this is 2 weeks in a row. This was after Chase Brown supposedly looked fantastic in training camp. The 4 touches here, 31 yards. He was in on a red zone play where the Bengals couldn't get their guys lined up. And so they had to call a timeout because their young players didn't know what they were doing. And then they brought Zach Moss in for the play. This is a really bad situation for them. And this coaching staff just seems awful. I mean, awful, especially in the first month. The level of preparation is really weird. And the thing that they actually benefited from so much in this game is that their run defense is apocalyptically bad. And so Kansas City's like, all right, we'll just hand off. So having a terrible run defense has a lot of benefits for you. Now, you think to the Packers-Colts game, and that's one where mostly what's happening in that game is that the Packers are trying to manage the game because they have Malik Willis. But it's another case in which, because the Colts may have the worst run defense of all time, they were able to stay in that game because the Packers are just like, all right, we'll just hand off to Josh Jacobs over and over again. And then at the end, you're in it.
Both Shawn, you have to respect the pass. You know, when you have Malik Willis, so you have to be respecting the pass. Come on.
I mean, this Kansas City-Cincinnati game was really depressing because these are the teams that you want to be the headliners. These are the teams that you want to get up on a Sunday morning and think, this is the game that I can't wait to see. And then you get this game, right? I mean, the Chiefs were awful. They win because of a scoop and score, a questionable penalty in your mind on the pass interference. They win because Harrison Butker knocks down a 50-yard field goal when they don't try and make it easy on him by getting any closer. There's like, we'll take a 50-yarder. Even though Justin Tucker, the greatest kicker of all time, is a cold streak. To illustrate just how difficult those field goals are, we'll just wait for a 50-yard field goal to win. This was a terrible football game, and I think that that's depressing. But lots of cool things, as you mentioned. Mike Gesicki looked absolutely fantastic again. We get a deep ball to Jermaine Burton. He's somebody who could eventually be interesting in this offense. You get one of the all-time great touchdown catches from Andre Yoshivas, where he's basically parallel to the ground, 1 inch off the ground, both toes dragging, makes that play.
I think you get one of, and I don't know if it'll get talked about because the Bengals end up losing. I think you get one of the all-time interceptions here from the Bengals on Patrick Mahomes. One-handed sideline catch. You know, go. I just thought it was incredible.
Yeah.
Sometimes those highlights get forgot about based on how the game.
On who wins. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one, too, where as great as that play is, I mean, Xavier Worthy has to get involved in that. I mean, you can't be the receiver and be like, oh, the pass was barely underthrown, and then the guy made an all-time great interception. But I just watched the play.
Yeah, you have to knock that ball down.
So lots of elements there. I mean, one of the things, again, in this one is that fumbles, which haven't seemed to play, at least in my mind. It'd be interesting to go back and look through some of the numbers. We know that there's been such an emphasis over the last decade and a half, maybe this entire century, contrasted with thinking back to the 90s, for example, such an emphasis on not committing turnovers of any kind. And in this particular game, you have the scoop and score touchdown that ends up being fairly definitive. But in addition to Patrick Mahomes throwing a bad interception, throwing that incredible pick, you also get the Carson Steele fumble. I mean, this is a game where Patrick Mahomes throws for 150 yards. The Chiefs commit 3 turnovers, and they still win. This is a game the Bengals absolutely have to win.
And on the other side, the Bengals, like fans or the Bengals supporters may be saying like, well, you know, we've talked through that and we've said about, you know, how bad the coaching staff are doing in this situation, and they probably should have won this game. But I think that's almost in spite of what the coaching staff are also doing. There's a good game plan maybe, and they're trying to plan these things out to slow down Patrick Mahomes, for example, but they need to do better in these situations. The other thing you mentioned there, Shawn, was, you know, being prepared and being ready. And there's a number of these teams across the NFL that, you know, even as you're working through week 2, you can see that these teams are not, like, they've missed the preseason. They're not ready 100% to get going. And I feel like that's going to be a big story as the season goes on, because some of these teams are going to potentially miss out in the playoffs by, you know, one game here or there that they lose. There'll be some huge tiebreakers in certain situations. So this was a massive swing game, though, in that end of season race when you look back with the Kansas City Chiefs and, you know, the seeding and so on to get the win here, versus if, let's say, Harrison Butker doesn't make that field goal at the end. So big change overall as well in the NFL picture. Shawn,
crazy just how big a swing when you think about the tiebreaker as well, right? Because if he misses, then they're tied, and
both teams are 1-1.
The Bengals have the edge because they won head to head. You're saying that, you know, it's only a couple games in, but the Ravens are 0-2 as well. I mean, this is potentially very decisive. Whereas by winning, the Chiefs are basically up 3 games now because they're up 2 games plus, again, that tiebreaker. You know, I want to go back and just mention Jamar Chase refusing to practice, even though he's under contract for a long time. Not only does he do basically nothing in this game, but on one of the few plays that he does make,
cannot do this either.
At the 34-yard line, right? So
it basically cost the team the game at that point as well. You know, like, and I know that we say like, oh, you know, try not to get flags for, like, try not to like egregiously step over the line and continue to do it. Like, he, you know, there's multiple warnings there, but yeah, bad decision by Chase there. Shawn, I don't know if you've seen this game. I know that sometimes the Panthers get pushed to the end of the queue in terms of, you know, the priority list. I want to have a question, and if you haven't seen the game, we can push this to later in the week. But Quentin Johnston, Shawn, 2 touchdowns, 51 yards, 5 receptions. Is that because the only defense that's probably worse than the New York Giants is the Carolina Panthers?
I don't know. I mean, there were reasons to believe the Panthers defense was going to be okay this year. And it's not exactly like the Chargers run up the score on them. But man,
Shawn, the 2 quarterbacks here combined for 214 passing yards. It only took them 46 pass attempts though to get there. There was a point in this where I think that we had Bryce Young in the at the end of the first half. I think he may have been like 8 of 11 for like, I don't know, 40 yards. It's like, what are we doing here? 84 yards in those 18 completions. Let's try and go beyond the sticks and complete something, please. There are single passes this week in the NFL that had more yards than, you know, Bryce Young's entire games here. Like, let's go.
Colm, another team that is struggling with that a little bit, or 2 teams that are struggling. This was another situation sort of like the Giants and the Commanders, where very early the team that goes to 0-2 is mostly going to feel like their season is shot. With the Cleveland Browns, you have Deshaun Watson looking like one of the worst quarterbacks in football, and having, I mean, these are still things that happened a long time ago, but unfortunately new allegations coming to light there. In its own way, you sort of would hate if the Browns were able to get out of this contract, because they entered into all of this knowing that
off their own free will.
Yeah, of their own free will. So I think they should have to pay every cent of it. If to charity, if nothing else, and they should have that contract on their salary cap because this was voluntary, right? But you had Deshaun Watson.
I know I'm hitting on Bryce Young multiple weeks here, but like in my opinion, Deshaun Watson's a worse quarterback than Bryce Young.
Yeah, I don't know on that. I mean, Deshaun Watson did scramble a little bit in this game. He gets a rushing touchdown, but he does humorously throw 34 times for less than 200 yards. If you drafted,
that's still double the yards that Young got this week. So maybe he's twice as good as Young, actually.
If you drafted Amari Cooper, you've got to be disturbed that he drew the same number of targets as Elijah Moore, but also the quality of his targets were worse than the targets to Elijah Moore. Thankfully here, we do get Jerry Jeudy, somebody we promoted a decent amount, playing a pretty strong game. Made a couple of fantastic catches there. He ends up with 5 for 73, which isn't world beating by any stretch, but will not destroy your fantasy week like what Cooper did, for example. But on the other side, we continue to have more evidence that Doug Peterson may be done. I mean, you can be done as a coach just like you're done as a player. 14 for 30 for Trevor Lawrence, 220 yards. Doesn't throw a pick, but also doesn't throw an interception, takes 4 sacks on top of that. And as I was watching through this game, one of the things that you do know is that the Cleveland Browns probably have an elite defense, and that everything that they have dealt with over the first couple of weeks is in spite of the fact that their defense is bringing everything that they have, right? They were able to slow down the Cowboys in week 1. They were able to completely neutralize Trevor Lawrence and the Jags in week 2. There's the possibility that the Jaguars, freed from this type of matchup, will bounce back. And yet, watching this game, you're thinking to yourself, neither of these teams is going anywhere because of coaching on the one hand and the possibility that they didn't really upgrade the receiving core. One of the things they really wanted to do was upgrade. Is Brian Thomas better than Calvin Ridley? He's going to be. I don't think there's any question about that. And the one big play they do get is the 66-yard reception to him. They've got to figure out a way to get him more than 4 targets. That part was bizarre here. Gabe Davis doesn't really do anything. Christian Kirk, a second consecutive, more or less apocalyptic game. They're getting nothing from him. One of the things that's easy to overlook is that Zay Jones actually is very athletic. He's suspended right now, so we're not seeing any of that with the Cardinals. But losing him is a little bit of a problem. You go into this game against the Cleveland Browns and you don't have Evan Ingram, which, my heart goes out to everybody who had him ready to go, because then your lineup is just completely down a player before you even start. All of those things are difficult, but ETN looked very good in this game. Ernest Johnson had actually some really nice runs in this game. You simply have to be better on offense. Trevor Lawrence continues to look like, just a guy with a big arm, a guy with a lot of athleticism. He had a scramble in this game that went 33 yards. If you were playing him, that was a big chunk of the fantasy points that he put up.
There's a lot of stuff with Lawrence, like play to play. Like there'll be a play where you're like, "Oh, that's amazing," and then there's another play where you're like, "What's happening here?" I guess the other part, I don't know, you might have been going. Brian Thomas, only 2 receptions, obviously, but 94 yards. Looks extremely explosive down the field.
And you think about the 1-2 punch with Nabers and Thomas last year in college. It's easy to understand how Jayden Daniels could have had such extraordinary passing numbers. Again, you've got to get Brian Thomas more involved. On the Cleveland side, I don't even know what they really do, because, again, you've got Deshaun Watson as your QB. A couple of the runners looked decent. I mean, Jerome Ford broke some plays in this game, but they were mostly the function of other things. That there wasn't a play where you would look to and say, Jerome Ford did that. Yeah. They don't have playmakers with Nick Chubb injured and David Njoku out, and they don't have a competent quarterback. The other thing that you kind of got from this week related to Cleveland is the reminder that the Dallas Cowboys defense is actually not good. And so their performance in week 1 looks even worse than it looked a week ago. Yeah, that's very fair. The last game, Shawn, we're going to head on here today on this edition is
the Green Bay Packers and the Colts. A much more difficult day here in this one for Anthony Richardson. We do see a bounce back from Jonathan Taylor. I do think, as you hinted at earlier, a lot of that was, I think the Packers were trying to play this game obviously with a lead, but obviously trying to keep, the offense in front of them and, let them have the kind of the small plays and not give up the big explosive plays down the field, especially after what we've seen from the Colts in week 1 with some of their deeper touchdowns. But this one here feels like one where, obviously, as a Packers fan, I was over the moon to get a W here, but one that we can almost toss out and hope that Jordan Love is back as soon as possible. We get just a 14 targets, 12 completions for Willis for 122 yards, 1 touchdown. That leads to pretty much nothing throughout the fantasy days for the receivers. Jayden Reed 2 for 9, for example, 2 targets going his way, 2 targets for Tucker Kraft. We get 4 to Dontavian Wicks, 3 for 26. He does get in the end zone, and then we get 3 targets to Dobbs for 62 yards off 3 receptions. So we get 53 rush attempts, Shawn, in total, 261 yards on the ground for the Packers. This, as if I was a Colts fan, I'd be baffled as to how you just let and I know you're saying that in terms of the rush defense just been terrible, but Josh Jacobs has 151 yards rushing on 32 attempts. Just kind of this was the Packers' game plan going in. They executed the game plan. They won the game. The Colts do try and chase back in late, but get a late touchdown, and then they have a Hail Mary at the end that turns into a late interception. But I guess the talking points would be Josh Jacobs, Jonathan Taylor, veteran running backs. I'm not expecting this from Josh Jacobs. Moving forward, we did get Marshawn Lloyd coming in. He did only have 6 rushes for 15 yards, but good to see him active and available on his rookie debut. Anything to take away from this, Shawn, other than the Colts weren't very good and the Packers would love to get Jordan Love back to get some more into the passing game here?
Well, Romeo Dobbs on the 39-yard catch. Yeah. That's a fantastic play. I think if you are a Dobbs manager and you feel a little bit of regret because you see what Jayden Reed did in week 1, you see Dontavian Wicks getting in the end zone in week 2 and probably, being the second threat in the offense from a big picture perspective as the season goes along. You see that play from Dobbs and it reminds you why you drafted him, but also gives you a lot of enthusiasm that in the real offense, he can be a bye-week starter, that type of play, which for where you drafted him would be something very useful. We look at this game with Josh Jacobs to average less than 5 yards per carry against the Indianapolis Colts defense. I think might be worthy of criticism, especially when you had a 34-yard run.
Yeah, I was about to say that. One of those, and I believe that might have been first or second rush of the game.
This is a team that just gave up like 160 yards to Joe Mixon, even though he didn't evade a tackle last week. And I mean, Joe Mixon looked bad against the Chicago Bears. Now he also got hurt. So a variety of things going on there. But before he did that, I mean, he was getting wiped out at the line of scrimmage over and over. All of that is a problem because I do think one of the things that you're hoping to get if you have Jonathan Taylor or Anthony Richardson is simply some play volume. Now, in this game, you do get the 34 passing attempts from Anthony Richardson. In games they control, maybe you don't get that. But in a game where you come in against a Green Bay rushing attack that was just absolutely shredded by Saquon Barkley, you don't want to have a game where Jonathan Taylor only gets 12 carries. I mean, 12 carries for 103 yards, right? Again, because the Packers' run defense is that bad. But
he also only had 4 targets.
25 carries in this game easily.
He also only had 4 targets, so he got 2 receptions for 32 yards. No. He should have been factored in a huge amount more than he was.
And one of the reasons that happens is that Anthony Richardson had the type of game that if you're not a top 5 pick, the coaching staff is going to look at you and say, maybe we have to bench this guy. You have an interception early, which was basically just a punt, even though there was no pressure on him. The pick late is on a Hail Mary, but that was after earlier in the drive, he throws a pass directly to a linebacker who somehow manages to bat it up in the air. It's actually caught by the Colts in that situation, even though the pass was off by yards. The thing that you also have to do in this game is that if you have Anthony Richardson, he has to carry more than 4 times. Right? He has a 21-yard gain. That part, from a fantasy perspective, is excellent in and of itself. And it's similar to the situation with Trevor Lawrence. I mean, that's a big part of what you're looking for there. You get another big game from Alec Pierce, probably the most unsustainable 2-game stretch you're going to see in a long time, but maybe not. I mean, this is a game where Adonai Mitchell, on one of the handful of accurate passes that Anthony Richardson threw, he has a back-breaking drop. I just think this is a game that the Indianapolis Colts have to win when you think about how bad the Packers defense is and how limited they are on offense. But you could make the argument that the Packers are a bottom 2 or 3 team without Jordan Love, and yet they absolutely controlled this game to the point where they made no effort to actually go and score extra points. They made no effort before the half. I mean, this is the type of game that we don't really want to see in the contemporary NFL, but we're saddled with because passing no longer works across the NFL, and the rushing quarterbacks often bring some liabilities in the passing game because they're out there because they can run. And Malik Willis did some things. I mean, did the types of things in this game that you're frankly hoping that Anthony Richardson would do. Yeah,
and he managed the game quite well, and they get the win. We'll see if that, if he's in there this week. They did wait quite late in the weekend to rule out Jordan Love. Seems to be that there could be some positivity that he could be back next week. Feels like it will be NFL Week 4 when he is potentially back in the lineup, which is obviously a much more positive place than we were after that Eagles game where it felt like his season was in jeopardy. That is going to do it, though, for this edition of RotoViz OT. We did mention some of it at the start. Shawn and Ben did a immediate recap covering a lot of ground on the Stealing Signals YouTube channel. That is now available as a Stealing Bananas podcast. You can check that over on their feed as well. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.